Welcome to NCBA's Cattleman's Call podcast with host Lane Nordland.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to more conversations here on the Cattleman's Call podcast. As the voice of Dan McCarty said, my name is Lane Nordland, and today we are going to be talking about predators and their impact on U.S. cattle producers and just our rural communities across the nation. We're going to be joined by Caitlin Glover, Executive Director of the Public Lands Council and the National Cattlemen's Beef Association's Natural Resources Lead out in the D.C. office. Also coming to us from the California Cattlemen's Association, Kirk Wilbur is Vice President of Government Affairs for the association. Next, we'll have Robbie LaValle, former range and livestock specialist from the state of Colorado, and Brady Zook, President of Wisconsin's Cattlemen's Association. Thank you all for joining us here today.
Great, thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, it was quite an intro, wasn't it? Yeah. I didn't even stumble over my words there, so I thought
long titles.
Distinguished resumes, right?
Yes, they are. And mine's pretty short. I have an MBA, Master's in Beef Advocacy.
Excellent.
Well, for our listeners, the Endangered Species Act, it was passed back in 1973 and with the real intent to protect animals and that were at risk of extinction. But since then, we all know that it truly has become a burdensome for livestock producers when animals are not properly delisted once they are recovered. I'm from Montana. The grizzly bear is one of those species that has recovered in that region and is currently still not delisted. But there's many other animals that we're going to talk about here today that have been an issue in the past, but also been delisted thanks to hard advocacy work on behalf of so many livestock and outdoor groups here today. Now, our guests are going to give us an update in their insight from their respective states on predators like mountain lions, gray wolves, grizzly bears, vultures. And that's one thing a lot of producers in the West do not really understand are vultures and their impact on livestock as well. And that's my view as a Montana producer. We don't think about vultures, but I'm looking forward to that. And just all these issues that truly just impact livestock production across the board. So Caitlin, starting with you, could you just share an overview of the many predators that are currently protected and where and how these species are continuing to just impact livestock production and the lives of cattlemen and women every day?
You know, Lane, I think that the situation in the U.S. is best described as everywhere and profound, right? There are more than 2,300 species, plant, animal, vertebrate, invertebrate, you name it, on the endangered species list. And, you know, when you look at the patchwork of authorities, the patchwork of designations across the country, really what you see is that the whole country is affected. You know, and I think your discussion earlier about the origins of the Endangered Species Act really sheds a lot of light on the discussion that we're going to have today. 50 years ago, because we're now in 2023, 50 years ago, Congress saw a need to address imperiled species, saw a real gap in the ability to both fund and identify what some of those key things were going to be. But what we've seen over time is that the scope and the investment and the need has just continued to grow in a way that really just hasn't been matched by either congressional recognition or the process. When you're talking about predators specifically, of those 2,300, a lot of species can be considered predators. You know, typically, you know, I'm from Wyoming, right? You're from Montana, so we talk about the grizzly bear a lot. We talk about the wolves a lot. But you have every corner of the country that's affected. Whether you're talking about wolverines and the concerns with critical habitat, you're talking about pumas or you know, other Florida panther issues on the East Coast, Canada lynx, even, you know, not something that's going to prey on a calf or on a lamb, but even black-footed ferrets are considered predators in their own right, and have that ecosystem effect. You see a really profound impact on the way that cattle producers do business and the way they're able to manage those landscapes. We talk a lot about direct impacts from predation. It's pretty clear when you have these large predators, the evidence is clear. You see animals that have died. You see fairly significant death loss. And the federal government has recognized that death loss and the need to compensate those producers over time, not necessarily to make those producers whole, but to certainly mitigate the impact, especially where the Endangered Species Act is concerned. But really where we see a gap in that tool, or where we see a gap in that need, something that we've been discussing here in New Orleans this week, are the other maybe non-immediate impacts, the impacts that are very clear to our producers, but might not show up on your death loss tally at the end. That's the weight loss, your loss in yield, the animal stress, the additional handling that you have to do, because these cows get pretty wild. They don't want to come in from pasture, and the additional stress and danger that is experienced by our producers. So there's the financial piece, the loss, there's the management piece, the additional complexity, but then there's also the investment, right? The additional investments that producers make in infrastructure, fixing fence or creating new fence types, investment in livestock guardian animals, right? And a lot of other both emotional and financial investments that, whether you're talking about grizzly bears or you're talking about Florida panthers, that is universal. And look, I love talking about the things that fly, right? Thankfully, we don't have to talk about greater sage grouse in the ESA context, but we do have to talk about some other predator species. You mentioned vultures, right? And I think one of the things that we're going to continue to see this year, and maybe I'm getting a little ahead of myself, but we're going to see an increased interaction between the Endangered Species Act and other similar laws, like the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, that it prevents the management, but in an effort to protect vultures, ravens, and the like. So, Lane, really, we're talking about national scope, national impact. Every single county, every single cattle producer is going to feel this one way or the other.
Could you walk us through the process that it takes to actually have a species listed as threatened or endangered? Because it seems when you read about something being listed or threatened, it's pretty easy or quick. I know it's not like I Dream a Genie just going like that, but it goes a lot faster than the delisting process.
Oh, it does. I mean, and it's much more common too, right? When you look at the petition process, because the petition process is how species are most commonly listed, that a group of individuals or an individual submits a petition. They say that, I believe this species should be protected under the ESA, and I believe I have information that warrants consideration. And so when that happens, the service, by law, the Fish and Wildlife Service, is compelled to act. They're compelled to consider that listing petition. And they do that, not always in a timely manner, which results in lawsuits and additional heartache for all of us, right? But they consider 5 different factors in the listing process. We typically call that the 5-factor analysis. It has to do with things like the presence of range and the habitat that's available for the species, whether it's an animal or a plant, the impacts, the surface disturbance or other impacts to that habitat, disease or predation where it applies, and a few other things as well. But it's that listing process, or that contemplation of what the future looks like for the species, that causes and triggers that listing process. And that's effectively the same for threatened or endangered species, but everything that follows after that listing process is where the process diverges, and gosh, that's what gives me heartburn.
Well, I mean, you look at, I want to talk about wolves, we're going to talk about mountain lions in this conversation, we'll probably touch on grizzly bears as well, but just Congress gets involved, the courts get involved, and it sometimes seems that science doesn't come to the forefront in the delisting decision. I think we'll all jump into this, but I wanted Caitlin to really share that in-depth look at that. But it's emotion that gets involved, and political advocacy, good or bad, to the situation that really drives that delisting.
I think you're right. The challenge that we have is economic, it's emotional. There's the social challenge, but then there's also the scientific challenge. When we look at the money that Congress appropriates to the service and to the Department of Interior each year for ESA listing activities, that money is eaten up in addressing petitions or addressing listing actions. A couple years ago, I saw a statistic, and I'm sure it's far more expensive now, right? Because inflation, right? But it was something like $140,000 for the service to respond to a single petition. And the service has hundreds of petitions on an annual basis. And, that cost nearly triples when you're talking about a final listing action. And so that's even before we get to the recovery piece. And so there is a whole machine on the economic side that makes the act less nimble, right? The social side, of course, is the side that wants a federal regulatory process to guarantee an outcome. The ESA wasn't designed to guarantee an outcome. It was guaranteed to be a process to identify and assess a need, to be able to develop a recovery plan and implement that recovery plan. And then once you tick the box that you've done those things, you've met your objectives, to delist. And so often, it's both a blessing and a curse, right? Bald eagles and polar bears and all the rest. When you look at success stories where the ESA has been a definitive positive factor, folks want to say, I want to guarantee an outcome. I want to save this species because, insert their own reason here. And so the delisting process is so often challenged, not because of any scientific information or even economic, but just because people are afraid of the alternative. Mm-hmm. That's what we saw in wolves. That's what we see in bears. That's what we see in a lot of other species as well, where it's just too scary. Yep. And that's where the courts get involved, right? We've seen over the last number of years, the courts get involved in cases. They hear case after case in multiple jurisdictions, multiple challenges, where the jurists, the judges are being asked to evaluate the quality of science, whether they believe the scientific analysis was complete, whether they believe that science was done at the right place and the right time. In a way that the ESA never really contemplated, right? It was a process-based statute, not a quality-based assessment. And so, as we look at where we are now, so many of the listing decisions, especially in these predator species, are really like relitigating in the courts, right? But they're going back and trying to figure out how we make something durable with a judge who is going to look at science and say, I don't understand it, so therefore it must be insufficient. And you don't fix that through a regulatory process. You don't even fix that through a legislative process, but you do fix that in a combination of all of those factors.
Yep. Well, and like I said, it's an emotional conversation for both sides. Though those that want to keep a species that is recovered on the list, and those that want to see it delisted because they're being impacted out on the landscape. And really, everyone should be coming together to celebrate that those species are delisted. And wolves, Montana, we battled that for a long time when they were first reintroduced in the early 1990s. And now we do have a hunting season, but Congress had to officially go through a bunch of hoops to actually approve that Montana, Idaho, and Wyoming can manage their wolves. Currently, you can't manage wolves anywhere else in the U.S., and you can't hunt them. You can't, and our hands are tied. So that's why I'm excited to just talk about Wisconsin and Colorado. Colorado just had a referendum to reintroduce wolves. Well, Robbie will share with us there's already wolves in Colorado coming down from the north, and in Wisconsin that's a whole other issue that so many folks really probably don't even understand that producers are going through. But Brady, I'll start with you. What is it like? What is the situation like over in Wisconsin in terms of what these wolves look like? What are their size? Are they different from the hybrid wolves that we have in the northern Rockies? But welcome.
Yes, thanks, Lane. So when you look at the wolf situation in Wisconsin, our last official wolf management plan that our state DNR put together, our target population was 350 wolves. That was all the major stakeholders in our state coming together and saying this is the population target we believe we want to manage to. That was done in 1999. And here we are today in 2023 trying to get a new wolf management plan put together, but current population estimates are over 1,300 wolves based on the estimates that they can put together. When I visit with cattlemen's members across our state, they'll say that number is probably double. That's speculation, of course, but we've really seen that wolf population expand from the northern parts of our state that have more forest, probably a better type of habitat for a wolf. They're moving south and getting closer to bigger cities like Madison and Milwaukee. As far as you talk about the wolf size, I mean, you see a coyote out in your field and you see a wolf, it's a whole different kind of story. A wolf's going to stand easily over your hip high, a head the size of a basketball, and it'll send chills down your spine pretty dang quick. And we have seen some interbreeding, with those populations, but our population has just gotten so out of hand based on our lack of ability to manage it.
Mm-hmm. And Robbie, has the referendum that was passed in Colorado to introduce wolves. That's a tough thing to stomach when wolves are already there, and then you have to have a management plan for that reintroduction and everything that goes along that. Can you just walk us through that, what the voters of Colorado put forward, but also that complexity of wolves coming in from Wyoming already?
Sure. And so in Colorado, then they recently passed Prop 114, which indicated that the state would not only develop a wolf management plan, but also would reintroduce wolves onto the landscape. And despite the best efforts of everyone that clearly said, no, we already have wolves coming in from the north through Wyoming, we already have wolves that are coming in through Utah, and that to let them come in would be the most fair for the wolf as well as for the people of Colorado. The voters decided elsewhere and narrowly passed 51 to 49%. Prop 114 that did indicate that wolves would be on the ground and their wolf plan would be developed. And so with that understanding, everyone rolled up their sleeves, our Colorado Parks and Wildlife, as well as stakeholders and wolf advocates, and are working on and have proposed a draft wolf management plan, which is out for comment right now. But again, it does provide that complexity of the migrating wolves versus the introduced wolves, and how are you going to know which wolf is which when it is on the landscape? We're talking about hundreds and thousands of acres, just like the other states, the other western states, and Wisconsin as well. And so it does provide that level of complexity that has not clearly been answered in either the wolf management plan or any of the discussions with the officials.
And what are, because obviously there's depredation going on with those wolves in the state of Colorado. What is that looking like? I know in Walden they had that, was it 20? I don't even, I can't, we reported on this on our network, but the amount of cattle that were killed on one ranch.
Right. So specifically when we talk about the wolves coming down from Wyoming, they worked in the North Park area just across the state line around Walden, and specifically 6 head had to either be put down or were killed by the wolves that came in from Wyoming then. And so 6 head came and attacked one ranch, and they have not went past that ranch or went past that producer with the direct cost. It's very critical, just what Caitlin outlined. It's not only the direct, but the indirect. But other ranches around, similar to what we see and being reported in Wyoming and Montana and Idaho and other places, Oregon, is that indirect cost. And so those other herds around the one herd in Walden is being impacted by the indirect costs that we've talked about very specifically in the wolf management plan, and needs to be part of the conversation, whether it be Endangered Species Act or the state responsibility as it is in Colorado now with the passage of Prop 114.
Mm-hmm. And Brady, back to you. What are those attacks looking like? Are they doing this for joy? Because I know sometimes in Montana they'll come through and just kill sheep or cattle and just leave them. Is it not for joy? That doesn't come off right. For sport, there we go. That's a better way to classify it. But what's it looking like in your region?
Yeah, so we see, if you can pull the depredation reports from our state DNR's website, and you'll see, anywhere from 25 to 50 reports on an annual basis. But I think you look at the actual, those are what is reported today. That's a fraction of what's actually happening. We do see a big spike, of course, in the springtime. Most of our producers are spring calving, so we'll see a lot of attacks, on those young calves. But you can see all the way up to, attacking, large, mature cattle, right? So it's I think the major issue been in our state is that producers have been so frustrated with the process of reporting a depredation that, knowing that there could be potential compensation, but it's not going to deal with the long-term issues that Robbie very well outlined earlier. And so they kind of just throw their hands up and say, this isn't getting us anywhere. And especially we use a term in Wisconsin, the chronic farms that have multiple attacks over and over. And it seems like you mentioned, Lane, they find a farm that's either easy for them to attack the cattle, or they find it's just easy pickings. And they will continually attack that same herd over and over and over again. You'll see them listed multiple times in depredation reports, and extremely frustrating for those producers.
And I'm not familiar with your state's compensation of that. And you talk about it's just difficult to do. Is it even worth the while for the producers to apply for that? I mean, when you lose livestock, it's horrible and it's a financial hit, but the amount of time that goes into it, what is the talk with your fellow producers about that? Yeah,
so we kind of they'll collect the depredation reports throughout the year, and then there'll be a payout period usually towards the end of the year. So I think it helps them get their hands around the number of depredations they have to pay. So I talked to the producer this morning, Jack Johnson from north central Wisconsin. Had a Hereford calf that was killed by a wolf, and later that year he received about $400 in compensation. This has been about a year ago. So it's a little something to cover the loss there, but it's not what it cost him to feed that cow all winter. What does he do with this cow now that doesn't have a calf to go with her? And so I think that one thing that is important to note, Jack said the process itself. So our state partners with the USDA Wildlife Services to investigate the depredations. He said the folks that came to his farm were very willing to work with him and document the situation, which I thought was very good to hear from Jack's perspective. And it's a little bit of monetary compensation, but I also asked Jack, how else do you put a value on the rest of the damage? And he asked me back, he said, how do I put a value that I don't sleep at night? Because every time I hear the cattle beller one time, 10:30, he goes, I'm up, I'm awake, thinking something else could be going on. I think it's really hard to put a cost on the stress that it puts on our producers dealing with these issues.
Yep. And Robbie, what's that like in Colorado right now for wolves? Is there anything in place like we have in Montana, the Livestock Loss Board?
Well, that is what is being drafted in the wolf management plan. I mean, currently we do have the Parks and Wildlife has a game damage program, which is primarily lion and bear. And so that is what they're using for the base. Now, in the draft plan, we've taken it a step farther and actually started to introduce a system that will address the indirect cost if a producer can clearly show those decreased conception rate or weaning weights and that, then there are those dollars and process to compensate for that. However, in Colorado, then it's based on the willingness of the General Assembly to fund that through allocation of the general fund. And so we know down the road that there will not always be that interest in wolves. And so will there be their interest in actually getting general fund money? But that is again what we're all looking at and working very diligently on, is making sure that the funding lasts past 1 year at a time. Brady brings up a great point that we're seeing played out over and over. It's just that emotional toll that is very close and dear to the producers there in Colorado. And I know other producers in Wyoming have told me similar stories. It's that emotional toll when you literally see an animal suffering. There is a significant emotional toll that is not often told around the table when talking to those individuals that just think that if you introduce a wolf, the ecosystem will be balanced.
Mm-hmm. Well, and that's one thing, too. Their behaviors are so much different than they were years ago, too, towards humans, towards livestock, especially when it's easy pickings. But and Brady and Robbie both, you really can't do anything if you see a wolf attacking your livestock at this point. Is that correct? You can't harvest a wolf when it's attacking your livestock.
That's correct. It says they are federally protected now. We as producers, if we see a wolf attack, are supposed to just sit and watch that event happen, which thankfully I've never had to do that in our operation, but boy, that'd be awful hard to do that. There is no lethal means to deal with the problem wolf today.
But that's where Wildlife Services would come in if they were a problem, conduct an investigation, and then they would work with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services to then decide if they were going to make a cull of that pack or try to go around that. Is that how the process works for you all?
Well, today, the way I understand, they're not able to, remove or
Okay.
in the past in Wisconsin, they had done some trapping and relocation of wolves. So mainly what they'll do today, if there's a confirmed depredation, they'll either hang some kind of red streamer type of deals on a fence as a deterrent method, or they put a flashing light or a kind of like a noisemaker out there, or they encourage the producers to bring the cattle closer to buildings and facilities, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of our grazing management. And I think that's why producers are so reluctant to call in a depredation, because these methods that we're deploying just simply aren't effective.
It's different for bears, I guess, where where the state or the feds can step in, and if they need to take a problem grizzly bear out. Caitlin, did you have anything you want to add? I haven't let Kirk talk yet. I promise I'm going to let you talk. But Caitlin, do you want to correct anything that some of my misinformation I just asked?
No corrections here. I think probably one of my favorite stories. I think it's a Migratory Bird Treaty Act, but some of the deterrents that have been suggested to our producers across the country. Go down to the used car sales lot and get the inflatable arm flailing tube man. Yeah, exactly. And as a deterrent to harass the species away. But I think this is what Kirk is going to tell you. But definitely when you're talking about some of the larger predators here that have been, on the list and off the list and on the list and off the list and on the list again, and then just sort of in limbo, is that it's really unclear what those tools are. And when you have a state by state approach to either delistings or approvals or DPSs, it is sometimes an easier regulatory mechanism. But gosh, it makes it hard to have a consistent resource. So it's tough all around, but to be able to provide our producers some certainty, you've got to be able to have some of those mitigation measures built in.
Yep. And Kirk, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Now, being from California, mountain lions are managed much differently, obviously, in the state of California than other western states or states across the nation, because they've been protected under state law since before I was born in 1990. Could you talk about how that came about and just the impact that it's having now?
Yes, I can. And I think part of the story of how it came about really shed some light onto the challenges that producers are experiencing today in 2023. Proposition 117 was the proposition that went before voters that created a special protected status for mountain lions in the state of California. That was put on the ballot by the Mountain Lion Foundation. One of the founders of the Mountain Lion Foundation was Governor Gavin Newsom's father. So I think part of the political policy issue that you see these days with mountain lions in California probably does owe some of its origin to that familial link to mountain lions in California. And again, you see mountain lions being very popular in the state. When P22 passed away recently, a very famous mountain lion in the state of California, Adam Schiff and others were tweeting out eulogies to the animals. So because there is this sort of popular sentiment in favor of mountain lions in the state of California, you had Proposition 117 on the ballot back in 1990. Proposition 117, as originally implemented, wasn't all that problematic for my cattle producers. And the reason for that was it was really intended to prevent hunting, particularly hunting with dogs. And there is explicit allowance within Proposition 117 that allows a livestock producer to protect their animals from mountain lions. And that was also in the literature that went before voters. So it was very clear we still want producers to be able to protect themselves from mountain lions. But of course, mountain lions have become more popular in the state of California since 1990. The state has become even more urban since 1990. So there have been some policy shifts in California that have really made it more difficult for producers to protect their livestock. Those have occurred in 2013, 2017, 2020. I'm just really quickly going to overview a couple of those. There was a proposal in 2020 that's still working its way through our California Fish and Game Commission to list a ESU, I'm blanking on the phrase. environmentally significant unit, ecologically significant unit, and I apologize, in the Central Coast in Southern California as a threatened species under our state Endangered Species Act. That is still working its way, and of course, because Proposition 117 is on the books, any management of mountain lions would have to comply with Prop 117. But we've seen the California Department of Fish and Wildlife get really creative with how they implement Proposition 117. They have to allow take of mountain lions if there is a kill of a cow or other livestock. But take is a broadly defined term. It can include pursuit. So you see the Department of Fish and Wildlife in that ESU area in the Central Coast in Southern California having what they call a stepwise process. We call it a 3 strikes process. On the first instance, when you have a mountain lion kill a cow, you can perhaps pursue that animal or use some of the non-lethal deterrent measures that were spoken about with regard to wolves. On the second incident, you may be able to shoot it with a pellet gun, something along those lines. You may be able to do something that is more severe in terms of take, but is not lethal take. And only if you have 3 kills from the same mountain lion within a relatively short period of time will they then consider a lethal take permit. But that has to go up to the highest echelons of the Department of Fish and Wildlife for approval. In the rest of the state, where we also have mountain lion problems, they have a 2-step process. And what you really see at the Department of Fish and Wildlife is, yes, they are technically complying with Proposition 117 because they are permitting take, but they are doing everything in their power in the state of California to prevent lethal take that is really the best management option for those mountain lions.
And how do you prove which lion killed which livestock?
And that's the
that
rub.
Probably always gets brought up.
We recently, I obviously represent cattle producers, but we had some sheep producers contact us. In Lake County, California, mountain lions have recently killed dozens of lambs. And part of the reason that they have not been given a lethal take permit by the Department of Fish and Wildlife to date is because they have said, how do you know that's one animal that you can go after and make sure you're taking the right animal and preventing those further depredations.
So what are the numbers, I guess, per year that can be attributed to mountain lion kills in California?
So in terms of
actually reported or confirmed.
Right.
Yeah.
In terms of depredations, I don't have those numbers because, if you get a take permit for those 24 sheep that were killed in Lake County, that counts as 1 take permit. The most recent numbers I have are 2020. The Department of Fish and Wildlife authorized 249, I believe was the number, take permits. Only about 50 of those were successfully executed. We know that number is much higher, partly because what I just described. Mm-hmm. It is so difficult and frankly just so frustrating for producers to go through that process of getting a take permit when they know they're never going to be able to lethally take that animal anyway, that most don't bother reporting in the first place. But we have had, in recent years, 249 or so, 250 to 300 take permits authorized. We know the problem is much more significant for that.
And maybe you can't speak to this, but what is the outdoor community, the hunting groups for deer? Because I know in Montana, biologists say that a mountain lion will kill 1 deer a week. And maybe it's every 2 weeks. I think it's about 1 deer a week. And we had a female with 3 juvenile mountain lions on our creek, and it depleted our whitetail population for about 5 miles, and I would say it was almost 1 every other day or more. And even the whitetail on the bottom, but our mule deer up top also were impacted by that. So obviously this has to have an impact on the wildlife populations too in your state. What's the discussion?
It does. I haven't heard much recently from the sportsmen's groups because they lost this battle back in 1990 when this ballot proposition was put forth. I do hear it more often when it comes to wolves in California and other predator species. We have actually a very low population of deer and elk, ungulate species in California. It's part of the reason that we are so challenged when we have wolves reemerge in the state, or when we have mountain lions fully protected as a specially protected species, because there are so few wildlife out there that are the natural prey for these animals that they really have no opportunity other than to chronically go after livestock producers for their meals. So I haven't heard much from the sportsmen's groups, particularly with regard to mountain lions. I do hear from them with regard to wolves, for instance. They were part of a broad coalition that involved the California Cattlemen's Association, really trying to prevent listing of the gray wolf under the California Endangered Species Act, which unfortunately we failed to succeed in preventing that happening. But certainly we do see really damaging effects on our wildlife populations from any number of large predator species that has really just decimated those populations in the state. Right now, some of the places where we have mountain lions are not places where we have many ungulates, which is why you see often they'll be going after rodents, and you start to see rodenticides in those necropsies and whatnot. But the bottom line is, we do not have the natural prey base for mountain lions or other species in high numbers in the state of California. So there really has just been an increase in depredations of cattle, of sheep, because there's no other opportunity for them to get their meals.
Well, and it's just, yeah, I would assume that also the deaths of people's pets are also on an increase in those more urban areas as well. You think that would maybe have people, a lot of people call their pets their children. What is the reaction, I guess, when that happens from some people?
So occasionally, I'm not going to speak about the pets initially. Occasionally in California, there have been attacks on children by mountain lions. And there is usually some outcry in the localized community. But as I mentioned, these animals have been given celebrity status in the state of California. So the public, for the most part, wants to put that onus on the parent of the child, the owner of the pet, the owner of the livestock. I think it's one of those things, when it happens to you, it hits home. But until that happens, they are happy to have, the utmost protections from mountain lions. I actually received a email last year from a college professor who really wanted to fight the Department of Fish and Wildlife on its management of mountain lions because his dogs had been killed by mountain lions. So it is something we know happens with frequency. You see mountain lions more and more in urban areas. But folks, for the most part, until it is their family member, until it is their pet, until it is their livestock, they're happy to do nothing about it.
Yep. And I guess this brings it back to Washington, D.C. with Caitlin and the work that she and her team do out in Washington, D.C. to help producers with so many different regulations, but more in particular to these predators. Well, what is NCBA PLC doing to really work with these partners to protect their interests of their livelihoods, but also the cattle and sheep with PLC's perspective that they care for?
So I think that's a really interesting question, right? Because so many of the impacts of the ESA are far away from Washington, right? And so when NCBA looks at how we can be most helpful to individual producers, to state associations, and to the issue writ large, I really sort of bucket this out into three categories. First is the producer support, right? What can we do to work with USDA, to work with wildlife services, to work with states to make sure that your depredation compensation programs, that financial loss, even that producer stress loss, Brady, that you were talking about, is mitigated somehow, and that tools are available. A lot of those exist through federal appropriations and through other federal authorities. So we work on those regulatory and legislative activities all the time. When it comes to state associations, I think there's in-state regulatory support, right? Because there is a little bit of mission creep, just like, predators don't respect boundaries. Sometimes these issues tend to creep over the border a little bit. And what really struck me, Kirk, is that, you're talking about a state endangered species authority. And a lot of states have endangered species lists or authorities that are in your own state, have impacts on your surrounding states, and sometimes are in direct conflict with the federal Endangered Species Act, that makes this conversation so much harder to have in the realm of reality, right? And reasonable and common sense. And so really, I think where our focus is going to be this year is taking advantage of the 50th anniversary of the Endangered Species Act. Being able to look back and say, look, with Congress, we have come pretty darn close several times to making some improvements, to addressing some of the key pinch points that make the Endangered Species Act such a hard conversation topic to have. There is, there is a partisan divide sometimes in Congress when we start talking about reforms or improvements or modernization to the Endangered Species Act. But because of a lot of different authorities, right? Because we're going to be talking about the Farm Bill, because we're talking about an increase in the public's interaction with nature and therefore with predators, you have a different platform to be able to identify those pinch points when it comes down to the ESA's 50th anniversary. Our key concepts, our key pinch points, priorities stay the same, right? Elevating state leadership in recovery of species, leading recovery teams, making sure that the solutions that are proffered and funded are workable in the state. Wolf management looks a lot different in Wyoming or Montana than it does in Wisconsin or Minnesota. Certainly Florida panther conservation recovery looks a heck of a lot different than mountain lions in California, although some of those tools and authorities might be parallel, right, or might be the same. I think that the consultation process between states and feds will continue to be important. And then really making sure that there is a clear legislative direction and legal precedential support for that delisting process, because that delisting process is really the piece of this that's probably the hardest, right? Making sure that the agency prioritizes species for delisting, has the tools, has the resources available to make those delistings stick, and then a very clear direction to the courts as well that when there is a body of science that meets these specific criteria in the recovery plan, that the delisting shall and must withstand judicial review. All of those are things that we have been talking about really since probably the 90s, but how that is written in legislative language will continue to change. Our priority in Washington is to make sure that there is more regulatory certainty than less. And so, while Congress is having these conversations, while the agency is talking about their anniversary and going through their own regulatory process, our message continues to be the same. Whether you're talking about habitat and the habitat that is key for a number of species, or whether you're talking about the ability to lead in a meaningful way, that the science for recovery, there is a single group who is best poised to support, to lead, to really sort of blaze the path. You see the full picture in the livestock industry. You see the expertise around this table, myself not included, right? You see the expertise, the leadership, and the long history of pretty clear common sense, and that has to be at the top of the agency's priority list.
Now, from a more local, regional perspective, what are some of the campaigns or advocacy that each of your state and state associations and affiliates are working on public awareness, or are working with legislators that are willing to listen and advocate on your behalf? Brady, I'll start with you.
Yep. So as I mentioned earlier, Lance, we're right now working on our state DNR has released their proposed 2023 wolf management plan. There's several key pieces in there that we're very concerned about, the utmost being that there is no population target set. It's a ambiguous, healthy, sustainable population, and I forget the exact wording, but it's pretty hard to fail a test when there's no grading rubric, isn't there?
Yeah.
And so we're really, from our State Cattlemen's Association, really engaging in that process. We also have a new secretary of our DNR, so kind of two dynamics happening there at once, also engaging with the incoming secretary. And also we do quite a bit of partnership with other ag groups and also the hunting groups. So our wildlife conservation groups, our Bear Hunters Association, for example, that does a lot of bear hunting with dogs, and they've had a lot of issues with wolf depredation. Really partnering with those other state level groups and having public listening sessions. Unfortunately, our state DNR doesn't usually come to those, but we can at least get folks together to share the issues that they're having. And we're really encouraging our members, to make sure that our opinions as cattle producers are heard, because unfortunately, we do have a seat at table out of those wolf management boards, a seat on those boards. But when I talk to the producers that represent cattlemen's, when they listen to the testimony, 90 to 95% of what is shared is in favor of unlimited wolf population, no management. So we're trying to be as loud as we can in that 5 to 10% that we do cover.
And Robbie, obviously from the Colorado Cattlemen's Association and the other groups out there trying to be a voice for producers in the countryside in this draft plan that is currently underway in Colorado. What is some of the work that the livestock groups are doing in the state?
Sure, and so it's a combined effort. It is Colorado Cattlemen's, Colorado Public Lands Council, Colorado Wool Growers, Colorado Farm Bureau, as well as partnering with our sportsmen's groups and our county commissioners. Really, there is a strong coalition to say even though, again, a slim majority voted for this, they voted for it, but not in their backyard. They put it in somebody else's backyard. They put it on the western slope, where the primary is the federal lands. And so working again with that coalition that spans many uses, really to hammer home the point that the wolf management plan has to include those direct and indirect costs, that the ability to be able to take advantage of the indirect cost is not dependent upon that you put all of the non-lethal deterrents up when the wolves may be 200 miles away. And so all of those things we're working very hard on, as well as to continue to hammer home the point that, our ecosystem is not broken. It did not need the wolf, because that tends to be what some other agencies will pick up and try to make for their case to carry on as we see this species down the road. And then to highlight those very direct conflicts with the existing Endangered Species Act, primarily on the western slope, the threatened species of the Gunnison sage grouse. And there was no consideration the impact of that wolf on another threatened species. So, at the end of the day, like Caitlin always says, which species wins and at what cost?
Mm-hmm. And who approves that plan then?
So that plan will go to the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission and then on to our DNR, Department of Natural Resources.
Okay.
Yep.
Now, obviously, Kirk, since the 90s, this has been an issue, but just continuing to have that engagement with officials, with the public in California. What is that like? What are the struggles, but what are also those bright spots in these types of conversations to also shine a positive light back onto agriculture?
Yeah, and if you don't mind, I'm going to expand this more broadly than just speaking about mountain lions, because I think there's some lessons here with regard to wolves as well in the state of California. What we at the California Cattlemen's Association have really focused on doing is spending our time, our attention, our resources on battles we can win. We know that we're not going to convince voters in LA or legislators from LA to delist the gray wolf from the California Endangered Species Act or to repeal Proposition 117. Which has allowed CDFW, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, to not issue some of those lethal take permits, for instance. So what we've done, for instance, with regard to the wolf, we know it's going to stay fully protected in the state of California. We focused more on compensation plans, for instance. We know that isn't a solution to the problem, but it can at least help address some of the impacts for our producers. So right now, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has a compensation grant program that was authorized by some legislation passed, I believe, in 2020, to the tune of $6 million, and hopefully we can get that made permanent down the road to just provide some relief for those folks. That is one place where we can bring legislators together and find a way to at least soften the blow for our producers. With regard to mountain lions, again, that is a fully specially protected species in California. I don't see any way in which we change that. And frankly, if we open it up in the legislature, if we open it up at the ballot box, they probably get even more protections rather than fewer protections. So what we're focused on there is I'm pretty good at working with the California Department of Fish and Wildlife to make sure that folks get the full, take permit authorization that is allowed to them under the law, and really pressing regional officials or state officials at CDFW to make sure that they are actually doing what they are legally required to do to allow my members to take, whether it's lethal or not, those mountain lions that are causing problems. So I think when we're talking about what state associations can do with regard to these animals, one thing for producers, for producer members to remember, we're here for you. Give me a call at the California Cattlemen's Association if you're frustrated with your regional Department of Fish and Wildlife office. If you're having issues that Caitlin, myself, your other state staff can help with, call us up and we're happy to walk you through that process. I think very often we're going to have the mechanisms to get you those solutions, while you're busy on the range.
Mm-hmm. Now, Caitlin, as we mentioned earlier, there's a lot of ESA protected species out there, from apex predators to toads. I mean, it truly is wild to really look at the depth of what is a threatened or endangered species. But obviously for just people in Montana, Wyoming, Montana, a big apex predator is the grizzly bear. And, we're starting to have them come into our country right off the Rocky Mountain front. They have no respect for humans. They're not scared of humans. They, burrow into the silage piles, and they're getting into the grain bins, and they're just getting fat, and they're not scared of humans, and that's the biggest thing. And we have seen human deaths. Ovanda, Montana, a bicyclist was pulled out of her tent after initially scaring the bear off. This was last year. The bear comes back and kills her. Obviously, we would always say, well, nothing's going to really change until people get killed. Well, there has been deaths due to these apex predators. I know you have a great working relationship with Senator Brasso out of Wyoming, and he's a big advocate for delisting and looking at science. What is that looking like going ahead for delisting a species like the grizzly bear? Some people had said the wolf would never be delisted, and it has been. And state management in 3 states is congressionally approved. What is the talk in D.C. with the people that see the importance of having a species recover but taking them off the list once they are recovered?
Man, you're just asking me to do a lot of crystal ball math.
Yes, I am. I mean, because all I have to do is ask the questions.
Absolutely. I think the really interesting thing about a legislative delisting is that conditions have to be exactly right. You have to have a vehicle. It's never going to pass on its own, right? Conditions have to be exactly right that a majority, and in the Senate, a larger majority of the members, in the House, a simple majority of the members, believe that this is the right way to do something, and the president has to agree to do it, or you have to have, the math to override a veto, right? Or you have to bury it into a package that it is going, that the parliamentarian's not going to pull it out, right? And I don't pretend to be a parliamentarian, but they have used a fairly fine-tooth comb over the last couple of years.
They don't use Boppy's rules of order. They do use Roberts.
I think there are a lot of rules, and thankfully I don't have to know them all. But I think. Not to be punny here, but I think what the rule of thumb here is that when you are talking about a legislative delisting, it is an incredibly uphill battle. I think, when you're talking about what is going to change things, I'm saying that in air quotes here, what is going to change things, really what's going to change when there are human impacts is public sentiment. And public sentiment is going to inform the legislative process, certainly, but you have, I think, an outsized ability at the state level to influence either reintroductions or introductions, as in the case of Colorado, to influence state policy, that Kirk was talking about, or even to have a groundswell of support for producers in a population that is widely recognized as recovered and warranting delisting, Brady. And so your change in public sentiment, I think, is slow, but it's coming sort of around the corner. I think as you look at this Congress, as we sit in January 2023, a legislative delisting is going to be incredibly hard. I think there inevitably are going to be members who introduce a bill to delist the grizzly bear, to delist gray wolf wherever it is across the range, Mexican gray wolf, and a number of others as well, usually large predators. But that is an incredibly uphill battle. You have an incredibly slim majority in the House of Republicans who are typically more likely to support a legislative delisting. And you have a Senate Environment and Public Works chairman who is and was several years ago really motivated to work on ESA issues, but likely is not going to let something like this go, especially in a year where you have the 50th anniversary, some will call a celebration of a foundational conservation environmental law. I think it's an uphill battle here, but where I think we're seeing some really huge shifts are in the court system. Without getting too political and wonky here, the Senate over the last number of years has spent a lot of time confirming judges and judges who are the arbiter of a lot of these decisions. We saw some pretty favorable decisions out of the Ninth Circuit last year with respect to representing ranchers' rights, NCBA being allowed as an intervener in the gray wolf delisting case. Saw some really surprising and nice words given to the 3 consolidated ESA cases and the Northern District of California. And so the tide is turning, but in some unexpected places.
Yeah, who would have thought of that 10 years ago in that circuit?
I thought that I was having a fever dream. Nice words out of the Ninth Circuit and favorable decisions, 2 in a single week.
Man.
I would have thought it was impossible.
Yeah. Well, obviously, this is very, again, like I said at the beginning of our talk today, it's an emotional issue. It's emotional for people that are invested into seeing an animal that they feel they are invested in and seeing that recovery. I think Caitlin did a really good job describing that, but people are just so disconnected from that rural livestock production as well that they don't understand all the risk that goes in that too. And a friend of mine, Trina Jo Bradley, she sits on the state of Montana's governor's Grizzly Bear Advisory Committee. She ranches on the Rocky Mountain front, and she goes, my kid, her daughter, cannot play outside on their ranch because they have grizzly bears that close to their house. And she goes, her safety is paramount. She goes, my child has never been able to play outside by herself or enjoy herself on their own, in their own yard. And a lot of people will say, well, maybe you just need to move or you need to do this or that. And people can coexist. They can. There's great examples of that. But there's a lot more options and management options when a species can be managed by the state or a livestock producer can protect their livestock. I believe in Montana, and I could be totally wrong in this, you can only protect yourself if a grizzly bear is attacking yourself or your dog. And I could be totally wrong in that, but I believe it's yourself or your dog, but you can't protect your livestock. So that's, and again, let me know if that's not right, but I believe that's what I was told, but I'm not a full-on scholar of ESA on that front of the state of Montana. But any last thoughts before I'm rambling at this point, so it's probably best I let the guests conclude our talk today. But any last thoughts you'd just like to share with our audience out there? Brady, you're shifting. I'll let you go first.
Yeah, I think we just look forward to getting back to a time, in our state where we can have that control when wolves are federally delisted. Have that management back at our state level. We have the folks within our DNR that are working throughout our state, know the issue in Wisconsin, and we can work together as cattle producers, their DNR and our general population work together to find that balance. We can coexist. The Cattlemen's Association never said no wolves, but a reasonable number that balances everyone's interest, and truly, I think, balances everybody's interest, not the ones that speak the loudest, in their open listening sessions.
Kirk, closing thoughts?
Yeah, so just, piggybacking off of what Caitlin said about, a shift in public perception. Again, I don't see the public perception in California changing so much that wolves or mountain lions lose their protections. But I think there is a chance for increased collaboration across the aisle, so to speak. One group that we clashed with pretty strongly during the wolf listing process, for instance, was Defenders of Wildlife. They were very pro-listing of the gray wolf. We were very anti-listing of the gray wolf. But in the years since it was listed, they have come to realize the conservation value that ranchers provide. So in the state of California, they actually have purchased a large amount of the fladry that has been donated to wildlife services to help deter wolves from ranches. They have been supportive of a compensation program. So I think there are opportunities with that shift in public perception to at least collaborate on kind of creative solutions to some of these predator issues. It may not always look like delisting, but I think there is a chance for folks to increase understanding across the aisle and work to better the situation, both for those that are pro the wildlife species we're talking about and those that are pro ranching.
Robbie, any last thoughts or just anything that the great folks in Colorado are working on just to represent the livestock industry?
Thanks. And again, I just appreciate the words of everyone around the table here and just the good work that is going on. It has been rewarding as we've moved through this process to really broaden that scope and help individuals understand that, why we are so concerned about the welfare and health of our animals and why having that intensive management of our federal public lands allotments is impacted by the predators and by the presence of the predators. And so we have been able to provide education in all of this, but I do think it's going to take that continued effort and that continued concentration, especially when we think about modifying any language at all in the Endangered Species Act. It is going to be an uphill battle, but it is one that everyone around this table I know is well committed to continue on, that we can live with them, but we have to have the tools available to live with them.
Caitlin, I know PLC members and NCBA members will be heading out to D.C. for the annual legislative fly-ins. How important is it for folks to come out there and share their experiences of what it's like to have a depredation, what it's like to have cows or heifers or steers that just got ran around a pen all night by wolves, and a producer lost a majority of their profit because of that, and the breed back and everything like that? How important is that for producers to share firsthand with elected and appointed agency officials? And also just any last thoughts from your perspective in the DC office?
Lane, I think you outlined something that I'm just going to put a little bit of a finer point on. The stories of producers who experience depredation, those who have been engaged in the development of state wolf management plans or the depredation compensation programs, or those who are actively working, as your folks are in Colorado, Robbie, to working on plans to reintroduce out of need, maybe not out of individual desire, but willing to be involved in the process. It is a testament to how important these management factors are. Managing predator conflict is and will continue to be a factor in production scenarios. It shouldn't be something that either taxes or regulates somebody out of business. As cattle producers, as livestock producers work to manage these landscapes, it shouldn't be something that the ESA should never be the thing that makes them unable to do the good work that they do. So when our farmers, when our ranchers, when our permittees are meeting with their members of Congress, not only talking to them about the real personal impacts, the stress, the costs, but also to connecting those with solutions, that you as a member of Congress have the ability to change this reality, not by getting rid of them, but by finding a balance, finding a moderated balance, a better legislative construct, so that I, as a producer, all of my colleagues as producers can stop talking to you about this, because I know that that's probably what a lot of them would like. Finding that moderated solution, finding that middle ground, but then offering the very clear connection between significant impacts and what the future could look like.
Yep. When's the flying going to happen for PLC?
Well, so come on down or over or up, as it were. We're in New Orleans to Washington, D.C. We're going to be meeting the last week in April 24th and 25th. We're going to be having some great conversations with our friends at Wildlife Services and certainly the Fish and Wildlife Service on a lot of these issues, but then really trying to get them some help or motivation, depending on the agency, from their members of Congress and their delegations. Yep. This issue creates some unholy or holy alliances, some strange partnerships, and I think this Congress, there's a massive opportunity to capitalize on those.
Well, again, for more on that legislative conference for both NCBA and PLC, visit publiclandscouncil.com and the ncba.org and just learn more about those, because hearing firsthand from producers is so important. And for our producers listening in that can't make it to Washington, D.C., participate in your state calling on the Capitol or boots on the hill type days to be engaged and during those legislative times. In Montana, we only have a legislature every other year, so it's always important to take time to do that. But I want to thank the four of you for joining us here today. I know it's always busy during Cattle Industry Convention when this conversation was had, but gives us a break from walking around all day. So thanks for sharing your hour with us and your perspectives. And hopefully for our listeners, whether you're in livestock production or just interested in what we do in livestock production, I hope this was an educational experience on what so many producers go through just to be able to help feed the world, take care of our natural resources, and be stewards of our land for that next generation. Thank you all for joining us.
Thanks,
you.
Lane.
Thanks for having us.
Friends, that will do it for today's Cattleman's Call podcast. I'm Lane Nordlund. We'll catch you next time.
Thanks for tuning in to NCBA's Cattleman's Call podcast with Lane Nordlund. For more information, visit ncba.org and make sure to subscribe to the podcast today.